John Burgess graduated from Colorado College in 1976 with a degree in philosophy, then completed a master's in divinity from McCormick Seminary and a 1986 PhD in Christian theology from the University of Chicago. He is an ordained Presbyterian minister and has been a professor of theology at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary since 1998. He has visited Russia several times as a Fulbright scholar and with other support to study the Orthodox Church in Russian society. This article offers yet another perspective on the pendulum swings between religious and political authority in large-scale, complex, and differentiated societies. Burgess clearly has been influenced by Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, because he frames the contest between religion and politics according to whether religious leaders can say no to political authorities about anything. While this may have happened in East Germany, another place he has studied, he is less confident that it is possible in contemporary Russia. Burgess's observations about the Russian Orthodox Church give us just the tip of a vast iceberg of politics and religion. As usual, the great mass hidden below the surface is critical to our safe passage through the discussion. A good place to start is with the two terms in the name of this religious body, Russian and Orthodox. The word Orthodox comes from the Latin of the Roman Empire. Ortho means straight, true, or correct, so orthodoxy is right doctrine. The Christian religion spread through the Roman Empire during the 1st century AD. Their leaders were established in 3 regional patriarchates, Rome in Italy, Antioch in Syria, and Alexandria in Egypt. A couple of centuries later, the Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity as the religion of the empire in AD 313, and a new patriarchate was added in his new capital, Constantinople. Reflecting the split between the Greek-speaking eastern and Latin-speaking western halves of the empire, eventually the Christians also split along the same lines in the Great Schism of 1054. The western half kept the Patriarchate of Rome and became the centralized Roman Catholic Church led by the Pope. The eastern half, however, remained decentralized with a separate patriarch in each of the historic centers of Christianity. Since Constantinople had become the center of the Roman Empire, its patriarch also became first among equals in the Eastern or Orthodox Church. He established a subsidiary center in Kiev, now the capital of the Ukraine, just about the time of the split with Rome. But Rome itself got overrun by barbarians over and over in these centuries, and then in the 1400s, the Ottoman Muslims captured Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. With both Rome and Constantinople out of the picture, the Orthodox bishops in Moscow elected their own regional leader or metropolitan in 1448, about 50 years before Columbus set sail across the Atlantic. By the late 1500s, while England, France, and Spain were fighting over their colonies in the Americas, the other patriarchs recognized the Russian leader as a new Orthodox patriarch, and the Russian Orthodox Church, with its own recognized leader, technically was born. And they began to think of Moscow as the third Rome, the new center of gravity for the Orthodox faith. Since then, the Orthodox side of Christianity has continued to follow a model of nationalizing the church within each new nation state as these new political creatures became more and more popular. There are now separate Orthodox churches, each with their own patriarch, in Greece, Serbia, Russia, the Ukraine, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and many other countries, even the United States. This branching off of parallel independent churches reflects a very different view of the world from the Roman Catholic vision, a view in which the political importance of ethnic or national identities of population groups has come to play a central role. This raises the question, though, about the other word in the title of Russian Orthodox Church. What specifically is a Russian? The word itself comes from a bunch of Swedish Vikings who invaded the Russian river systems from the Baltic. But the main component of Russian ethnicity, along with the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, is its version of the Slavic family of languages. Just as Orthodoxy has mutated into many local forms among different nationality groups, Slavic languages have done the same thing. Western Slavs, like the Poles and the Czechs, also adopted Roman Catholicism and the Latin alphabet, while Eastern Slavs, like the Russians and Ukrainians, are Orthodox and use the Cyrillic alphabet invented by Bulgarian monks, again at about the same time as the Great Schism in the 9th and 10th centuries. Russians are a classic case of ethnic identity composed of a special blend of shared history, language, and religion. And Russia as a country is dominated by and for these ethnic Russians. In this focus on a shared ethnic identity, to say you are Russian is just about as different from saying you are as an American as to say you are Orthodox rather than Roman Catholic. In both cases, the introduction of the ethnic nationality issue makes such comparisons a matter of apples and oranges. Russian history also presents us with a classic panorama illustrating the ebb and flow of the relative power and authority of political and religious institutions in society. The high point in the power of the Russian Orthodox Church probably came in the middle of the 1600s, when Tsar Alexis took off for a war with Poland and basically left Patriarch Nikon in charge, with full sovereign powers to run the country. Nikon firmly believed that the church should be superior to the state and attempted to make new policies that would bring this about. He overreached himself, however, and when the Tsar got back, Nikon ended up in a monastery. A couple of generations later, by 1721, the pendulum had swung to the other extreme. Tsar Peter the Great decided to get rid of the Patriarchate completely and replaced it with a committee of church leaders that he controlled. For the next 200 years, the Russian state was definitively in control of the Russian Orthodox Church. There were still Orthodox churches, holidays, bishops, and even a metropolitan with a seat in Moscow, but everybody knew who was the boss in the Russian Empire. This dominance of the state over the church remained firm until the whole political institution of the Russian imperial state collapsed under the weight of the First World War. In early spring of 1917, bread riots and social unrest led Tsar Nicholas to resign, and the empire came to an end. The Duma, or National Assembly, set up a provisional government, and in this new political vacuum, the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church immediately got together and proclaimed Bishop Tikhon as the first patriarch in 2 centuries. A most interesting character, he had been the Russian Orthodox Bishop of Alaska in 1898, while it was still Russian territory, and also spent a couple of years in New York City as Bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church in North America, before going home again in 1907. He had 6 months as patriarch before the Bolsheviks seized power from the Provisional Russian Republic in October of 1917 and established the Soviet Union. We'll turn to that chapter of the story in a moment. At this point, though, we might consider whether any lessons about the relation between politics and religion emerge from the story so far. You may well ask whether the domesticated nature of orthodoxy in Russia may have been a special disadvantage in the enduring struggle between church and state. The decentralized tradition of Christian orthodoxy has been based above all on the idea that different populations are somehow naturally divided from one another by boundaries of ethnic or national identity. When you play this ethnic nationality card in the game of politics, you automatically create in-groups and out-groups, boundaries that undermine any social networks that might bridge between such groups. When religion serves as one of the defining foundations of such ethnic nationality, as it does so often, as here in the case of the Russians, you isolate the religious institutions within your nation-state from those in other countries and inevitably weaken their ability to support one another based on any common denominator of actual religious bonds. The national Orthodox churches in every nation-state where they're found share this same fundamental liability. The Russian Orthodox Church has been surfing the waves of politics for more than 1,000 years, ever since it emerged as its own distinct brand of Christianity in the twilight of the Byzantine Empire. The 20th century, however, brought some of the most drastic challenges in its history. Although the church took advantage of the chaos of World War I to name the first new patriarch in 200 years, Patriarch Tikhon was in for a disappointment. Only months after he took charge of the church in 1917, the Bolshevik government took over and began its war on religion. The church lost its property, priests lost the right to vote, believers could forget about joining the Communist Party, which meant no chance to rise in positions of leadership in any other social institution outside of the church. The communists did not actually outlaw religion, but they used every excuse and opportunity to weaken it as a separate source of authority in society. The patriarch spoke out against godless forces, so in the long Russian tradition of dealing with opponents, after a few years he was exiled to a rural estate where he remained until his death in 1927. No new patriarch was allowed by the communist government, and anti-religious propaganda continued energetically. Just as with the fascists in Italy and other totalitarian political parties, the communists in Russia wanted to absorb all other institutional dimensions of society back into the political order and centralize control over all aspects of life in a single top-down system. They wanted control of the legal system, the press, the economy, education, and everything else. Faced with an organized religion, which in this case was also practically synonymous with being Russian, they still thought they could sweep it away with a new political religion, another puzzle piece in their unified control of Russian society. They had their own saints, martyrs, and holy leaders, starting with Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and other leaders of the revolution. They had their own holy scriptures, including the Old Testament of Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Again, very much like the Italian fascists, they created their own public ceremonies, holidays, initiation rites, and other ritual substitutes for religion that could bring people together with flags, uniforms, music, and all the trimmings to create a public feeling of unity and empowerment. We can see here again that a political religion is not the same thing as civil religion. Rather than defining the boundary or overlap between two distinct, differentiated institutional spheres within society, the political religion of the communists attempted to eliminate religion as a separate, differentiated dimension of social life. Without a patriarch after 1927, frozen out of the political system, watched over by the secret police, and vilified by the politically controlled mass media as useless, corrupt fossils of an age gone by, Orthodox priests inside the Soviet Union continued to lead small groups of believers. Many of them, however, had to make compromises with the communists in control of society. There were plenty of cases in which priests passed information to the secret police and other authorities about dangerous characters among their followers who might cause problems for party control of life. For a generation, the Orthodox Church pretty much went into eclipse in Russia. The communists looked like doing an even more complete job of creating a new political religion in the population than the Italian fascists had managed to do. The only thing that may have saved the Russian Orthodox candle from going out altogether was that each of these totalitarian political movements had harnessed itself to the underlying force of nationalism, the rising spirit of the last 2 or 3 centuries. Originally, communist doctrine insisted that the most fundamental groups sharing common interests in all societies were economic classes, particularly the workers who sold their labor in the open market. This meant that workers all over the world logically should all join together in their own interest and create a world revolution to claim their fair share of the fruits of their own labor, doing away with all national borders in the process. But such intellectual appeals did not tap into the current of nationalistic sentiments flowing through the world, so it didn't take long for the Russian communists to convert their political religion to the idea of establishing communism in just one country to start with. Once they put their boats into the current of nationalism, it swept them along just as it did the Italian fascists. The trouble with nationalism, as we've already seen, is that it automatically pits the people in your nation against your neighbors in other nations. Sure enough, before they knew it, the Russian communists and the Italian fascists, each busy with their own attempts at creating a political substitute for religion, both found themselves trying to kill each other in a world war. The Second World War didn't go much better for the Russians at first than the First World War had done. By 1943, German armies were at the gates of Moscow, had Leningrad, or as we know it, Petersburg, surrounded, and were fighting in the streets of the distant city in the Ukraine that had been renamed for the current communist dictator, Joseph Stalin. Stalin looked around to see what kind of additional resources he might put his hand on to avoid losing the war completely. One of the answers he found was to end the persecution of the church and even allow the appointment of a new patriarch, Sergius, who returned the favor by wholeheartedly enlisting the church in the war effort to save Holy Mother Russia. This, of course, got Stalin's communist government even deeper into the current of nationalism, but it also saved his bacon and helped to save the country and win the war. As soon as the war was over, of course, the communist leaders went right back to their original project of trying to replace the church with their own new political religion. Post-war leaders like Khrushchev and Brezhnev did not do anything drastic like eliminating the patriarch or outlawing religion, but they renewed their earlier efforts to marginalize the Orthodox Church in the hopes that organized religion as a separate, differentiated sphere of social life would gradually wither and disappear. However, in the contest between the 1,000-year-old Russian Orthodox Church and the new political religion of the communists, it was not orthodoxy that disappeared. Just as in the case of the Italian fascists, the experiment to undo institutional differentiation and fuse all the different institutions together into a single top-down hierarchy produced fatal problems for the Soviet Union. With no flexibility or possibility of feedback control through different institutions that checked each other's mistakes, the Soviet Union also blundered into a dead end, this time of economic inefficiency and waste. The Soviet economy kept producing less and less while using up more and more resources in the process until near the end of the 20th century, the whole system finally collapsed of its own dead weight, carrying the political religion of its communist leaders down into the rubble with it. And the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was right there at the end in 1991 when the hardline communists tried a last-gasp coup against then-President Gorbachev. He supported Gorbachev's reforms, put his finger on the scale, and tipped the balance to bring the whole 7 decades of the communist experiment crashing to the ground. The collapse of the communist government of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened a window of opportunity. The Russian Orthodox Church got a chance to reassert itself as a separate institution in Russian society, similar in some ways to the window of opportunity that had opened in 1917 with the collapse of the Russian Empire. Even though the communists declared a separation of church and state, though, they intended that separation to leave the state alone on the stage, while the church was simply eliminated from the script one way or another. That didn't happen. Instead, the communist regime has disappeared from the stage, leaving behind many of its top officials to rebrand themselves in a new social landscape. But what kind of role does the Russian Orthodox Church play in Russian society today? Burgess tries to unwrap this riddle as best he can, admitting that he is just a Protestant from the USA looking in the window as a stranger. Sometimes, though, a stranger looking with new eyes might see some things that local observers might miss. After all, they say that the last thing that a fish would ever notice is the water all around it. The Orthodox Church has regained what Chavez would call internal or organizational religious authority. Church leaders now control and define who gets to be called a priest, or a metropolitan, or even a patriarch. They have regained control over an income stream, to at least the same extent as can be said for the religious groups in Western Europe, if not perhaps to the same degree as in the United States. But at the other two levels of religious authority, the picture is not so clear. At the third or societal level of religious authority, It appears, according to the description by Burgess, that the church in Russia has regained at least some small say in the negotiations among societal institutions. The church has something that the other institutions badly need and want. Both the incredibly corrupt economy, now in the hands of former communist leaders who managed to grab up most of the oil wells and factories and other assets for their private collections, and the heavy-handed political monopoly on power by former communist officials who managed to privatize the secret police into a mafia serving their own ends, have a problem. They have all the power they could want, but in the eyes of Russian society as a whole, they lack legitimacy. They lack authority. That is what 1,000 years of Orthodox religion brings to the table, authority. If the gangsters running Russia as the biggest protection racket in the world can appear in public with a smiling Russian Orthodox patriarch, they'll be able to rest easier in their beds at night, and will be willing to grant some of that power to the church to pursue its own ends in society. Burgess reminds us that orthodoxy promotes personal values of honesty, concern for one's neighbor, and a glimpse into a world of healing and peace. These moral values, derived from the Christian Orthodox tradition, are the basis for the religious authority that other, less honest, less concerned, and less peaceful leaders of other institutions want so badly. As a result, we may be witnessing at least some redifferentiation of institutions within Russian society, as the church discovers a few small shafts of institutional daylight for itself among other institutions. But Burgess also has a word of warning about this apparent trend. The church will play a responsible social role, he warns, only to the extent that it is clear about its own theology and way of life. Patriarch Filaret from the early 1600s, who spent a good part of his life locked up for his troubles, said this more plainly. A fish that is alive, he pointed out, swims against the flow of water. One that is dead floats down with the water. A true Christian goes against the current of this sinful age. A false one is simply swept away by its swiftness. Can the church ever say no to other social or political forces in Russia? When everybody coming from every different institutional dimension of society agrees on something, there's no way to tell whose authority actually was decisive in such a situation. But when different institutions pull in different directions, we can see who wins the tug of war. Burgess is not optimistic that the Russian Orthodox Church is ready to exercise this kind of religious authority at the societal level. At the individual level, he also has his doubts about religious authority. The main question addressed by his article asks whether a civil religion is emerging in Russia. If we understand this term in the light of Bella's treatment of it, we will look for an expansion of religious identity at the individual level, among other things. And sure enough, we find this trend clearly marked in public opinion research in Russia in the past 3 decades. At the collapse of the communist regime with its atheistic political religion, a large majority of all Russians rejected affiliation with any religious faith. But less than 2 decades later, nearly 3/4 of the entire population identified themselves as Orthodox. This widespread resurgence of religious identity should translate into further increases in the bargaining power of religious authorities when the time comes to negotiate with political, economic, and other leaders in society. But Burgess is not overwhelmed by these survey results. He points out that if you ask a few more questions, you find out that all these Orthodox believers really know very little about what they're supposed to believe. 2 or 3 generations of systematic repression of religious education and other forms of teaching the beliefs of the church had a dramatic effect. While it was not illegal to be a believer and a church member, it also was not allowed to teach or preach or otherwise evangelize anybody outside your existing community of believers. The result is that saying they are Orthodox is mostly wishful thinking for most of these Russians, because they have no idea what it really means. It amounts to something like a fashion statement, or perhaps just another way of saying that you are a Russian. After all, we have seen that the Russian identity itself is simply a mixture of a particular historical experience, a shared language, and a shared religion. All those Orthodox Russians, says Burgess, probably see themselves as Orthodox just like they speak the Russian language, because that's what it means to be Russian in the first place. This ethnic nationality aspect of Russian Orthodox religiosity appears from another angle if we take note that in 2018, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch cut off all contact with the Patriarch in Constantinople, that is, in Istanbul, who is still, at least on paper, the senior, first among equals of all the patriarchs for the last 17 centuries. This split came because the Patriarch of Constantinople, who has some quite peculiar political connections of his own, recognized a new patriarch for a separate Ukrainian Orthodox Church, breaking 13 centuries of the tradition that the Ukrainians were subject to the Russian Patriarch in Moscow. Today, the contest between the political bosses of Russia and the Ukraine has spilled over into a parallel contest between the religious leaders of the two countries. Are the politicians helping the patriarchs, or is it the other way around? This is what you get when you nationalize religion and link it to the ethnic nationalist currents running in the world. One has to wonder whether Patriarch Filaret, if he looked in on us today, would say that this fish is alive or dead.